So now we've talked about the rules that apply inside of home during the match. We're going to look at the rules that apply to outside of home. And since the table consists of these two home areas and then the mat itself, this is basically any rule that's going to apply when you're on the mat or when you're not completely in home. So the first rule is about interruptions. Okay, so remember, interrupting the robot is just touching or interacting with the robot or something the robot is in contact with. So in this case, you interrupt the robot, and if you interrupt the robot, it has to be relaunched. So this is what's important. If your robot is in the launch area and you start it going, and then it leaves the launch area at all, and you try to course correct it just by bumping it, that's an interruption, and you have to bring the robot back to the launch area and relaunch it. So if you touch the robot, it has to go back to home, and we'll talk about the exception in a moment. But in general, assume if you're touching the robot or interrupting the robot, which remember has a very specific definition, if you interrupt the robot, it has to be relaunched. You can't just let it go off and be course corrected. So the robot and anything it's in contact with, you can lose a precision token here. So this rule here is saying, right here at the bottom, if the robot or anything was in contact with at the time was outside home, even partly. So you can catch the robot when it's in the launch area and you'll be okay here. But if it has left the launch area at all, or it's not in home completely, so if it's partly outside home, interrupting the robot here will lose a precision token. So that's a big deal there. We'll talk about why you don't want to lose precision tokens in a later video. So that's a key thing here with how you'll lose precision tokens from interruptions. Now, there's also a little bit more to this rule. So if the robot and objects it's in contact with were partly outside home, so they're in home, kind of overlapping with the mat, then they have to be brought back to that home area. So if you launch from the left home area the left launch area where the First League League Challenge logo is, and you are still partly outside of home, or you're coming back to a home and you're partly inside the left launch area or left home area total, you have to bring it into that launch area. So if you are partly outside home, that means partly in home, partly out of home, you have to bring it back into that home area when you interrupt. If it's out on the middle of the field and it gets interrupted, so that's completely outside of home, then you can return it to either home area. So if you're over here in the middle of the field and you're interrupting your robot there, and you're a technician on the right-hand side, but you launched it from the left-hand side as a left-hand technician, that's okay. It can go to either launch area because it's not partially in either home. So depending on where the robot is when you interrupt it will determine which home area it can go back to. Now, here's a key piece to this. Any object that was obtained after the robot was last launched. So you sent the robot out with something while it was out doing its thing. It grabbed another game piece, another mission model, and it's heading back and you interrupt it, but it's completely outside of home. In that case, anything the robot obtained after it left goes back to the referees for the rest of the match. So let's say you pick up this expert model while the robot's driving around and you interrupt it in the middle of the field while it's completely outside of home. This mission model will go to the referees and you won't get it back for the rest of the match. However, if the robot obtained it and is partially in the home area, then you get to keep it. So pay attention. This is a good way to lose opportunities for points by losing mission models. So pay close attention there. And then there is an exception to this rule, and that's saying that if you interrupt the robot and do not intend to relaunch it, you don't have to relaunch it. So this is a good way to kind of end the match. You can say, hey, my robot's out here. I'm going to interrupt it. I'm going to leave it there. And this is a good kind of strategy to have if you're worried about your robot bumping into something to undo something you already scored. Because we talked earlier, all scoring happens at the end of the match. So this is a way to kind of avoid that. Now, there's a reference here to Rule 3 on this page, which we'll get to in a moment. But the big note here is that you can do this to save yourself from losing points, but you can't do it to strategically score points. We'll talk about that when we get to that rule. But Rule 1 is definitely the most complex and has the most kind of branches and exceptions to it. I would spend a lot of time making sure I understand this rule. So Rule 2, we're talking about what happens if you have a piece of equipment or a mission model dropped or left outside of home. The first thing you want to do when the robot drops something is wait for it to come to rest. So don't do anything until it's done moving. If it comes to rest and it's completely outside of home, leave it where it is. It stays as it is unless the robot does something to it. So you still can't touch it. But if it's partly inside home, it stays as it is unless the robot moves it. So these two pieces, this first part, is the same as the completely in home. But this is the part where it's different. So at any time, a technician can move it by hand if it is partly inside home. You can't do this if it's completely outside home. So it has to be partly inside home. So the technician may move it by hand. If it is a mission model, right? So not equipment. If it's a mission model, you have to give it to the referee for the rest of the match. So that's the same as what happens here with things that are obtained by the robot outside of home after the relaunch when the robot's interrupted completely outside of home. This behavior is the same. You can touch it if it's partly in home, but if it's a mission model, you give it back to the referee for the remainder of the match. If it's equipment, it must be taken in that home area. So if it's equipment, so maybe part of your robot broke off and you're laying it, it came to rest at the border on the left home area and it's partly in the left home area, and you touch it, it has to go into the left home area. It can't go into the right home area. And the team loses a precision token. So a good rule to kind of follow here is if you can, let the robot bring it back. If you cannot, this is what you have to worry about. If it's a mission model and it's partly inside home and you grab it, then it'll go to the referees for the rest of the match. If it's equipment, it'll go into that home area. You get to keep it, but you lose a precision token. Just like if you interrupt the robot when it's outside of home, not completely inside home. So Rule 2, a little bit less complex than Rule 1, but still a pretty complex rule. Make sure you understand when it applies. All right, Rule 3 is related to Rule 1. It says basically that you can't strategically interrupt your robot. So interruptions can happen for any number of reasons. There are reasons to do it, reasons not to do it. The key thing to know is you cannot interrupt your robot to earn points that you would have otherwise not earned. If you do anything that would cause that, they will not count. And so the kind of rule I like to say here is you can interrupt your robot to save yourself from losing points, but you cannot interrupt your robot to gain additional points. Otherwise, they will zero out that score. Not for the whole match, obviously, but just for that one mission you're attempting. So in these cases, rules 1 and 3 are listed as being in the new this season because they weren't specifically in the rulebook last year as written. They were updated with some updates during the season for both of them, I believe. Rule 4 is another one that we've seen in seasons past. One, you can't separate the dual lock, so all the models that are attached to the mat are attached with dual lock, which you saw earlier. You are not allowed to separate that. You can't take the models apart. You can't break the models. You can't do any of that to it. It's not allowed. One of the things to note is if the mission is made easier or possible because of you doing something like that, they're just not going to count it. They also say that we don't want to combine the robot with the mission model, and that if you are putting the mission model in the robot or attaching it to the robot, basically you're going to want to follow this part of the rule saying that if asked to, a technician could immediately free the mission model in perfect original condition. So you want to be very careful about how this rule is worded. You want to make sure that if you are attaching your mission model to the robot during the course of the mission or the course of the match, that you can meet this criteria. If you make a combination that doesn't pass this test, you're going to lose those points. And finally, this one we don't ever see happen too much, but it could happen on accident. You got to be careful with it because this rule even applies in an accident. Because the way the tables are laid out, you're actually doing two teams are playing at the same time, one on one table, one on the other table. And this says that teams may not interfere with the opposing field or robot unless there is a mission exception. I don't believe there's any such exception this year. So that's just kind of a, stay on your side of the field, don't interfere with the other team on their table, because if you do, there's no real penalty for you, but it will score points automatically for the other team, which factors into the overall robot game ranking at the end of the day, which factors into your overall scores. So pay attention to that, because helping the other teams, on purpose is great, but you don't want to run the risk of hurting yourself in the rankings if you can avoid it by not breaking rules. So those are the rules that apply outside of home, and this is probably the page I would spend the most time on between the two, just because this governs a lot of what happens if there's a mistake. If everything's playing normally, that runs pretty smoothly. If you need to change something or touch your robot, these rules start to kick in, and this is where you can lose mission models that will impede your ability to score points the rest of the match, or will cause you to lose precision tokens. So definitely pay attention to these rules and make sure you understand them before you get to a competition.